Well, here I am, ready to get started with the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And I have a cat who's bothering me. This cat has no respect. This cat is impious and improper. Okay, today we're going to get on to the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know if we're going to be able to get all the way through it. It's only 3 chapters in the book of Matthew, 5, 6, and 7. But we're going to be doing a lot of cross-referencing with Old Testament scriptures today, a lot, in order to understand the basis for Jesus' teachings here. And so we may not be able to get all the way through the Sermon on the Mount today, maybe. I'm going to try. The Sermon on the Mount was likely, almost certainly, in fact, not this account here, as Matthew records it in chapters 5, 6, and 7, what we call chapters 5, 6, and 7. Matthew himself didn't number his book that way. Is almost certainly a composite sermon of Jesus' overall message throughout his ministry. Yeah, what are you doing? Why do you have to do this? My cats like to annoy me. Luke has some of this material. Mark has a little bit of it here and there. Luke has some of this material in his gospel, but he has it broken up into sections. And Matthew, the original copy of Matthew, I've talked before about how Matthew was probably originally written in Hebrew, and then which was likely just a collection of Jesus' teachings, and then at some point later on was rewritten in Greek. I wouldn't say translated, just rewritten in Greek. And Matthew himself may have written a version of his gospel that had the sermon broken up into chunks, because there is a surviving Hebrew document of Matthew that has the sermon kind of broken up into chunks with a statement. Again, Jesus said to his disciples, kind of prefacing different parts of the sermon. And where you see that statement in the existing Hebrew manuscripts of Matthew, those parts of the sermon are parts where Luke jumps around in his gospel, or doesn't have those verses at all. So I'm actually going to read those. When we get to those spots, I'm going to insert that phrase. Again, Jesus said to the disciples to kind of demonstrate where the sermon may have originally been broken up, even in the early Gospel of Matthew that predates the one that we have. So it wasn't, this is a composite sermon. Again, this is very common in Jewish writing, or ancient writing in general, really. That's what the prophets did. Okay, we talked about that when we read the prophets. Just about all the prophets bear signs of having given their message, spoken their message out loud initially, and then at some point later on, sometimes not long after. Like in Jeremiah's case, we see a number of examples of him writing down, or his secretary writing down his message not long after he spoke it, and they do that several times. In some cases it may not have been very long after they spoke their message. In some cases it may have been after the ministry was over, and either they or their scribes kind of left a written preservation of the substance of their message. Like Amos, for example. Amos apparently had a fairly short career as a prophet. He was a prophet from the south who went to the north, spoke his message, was told to leave. He did leave. He finished his message first and then did leave, apparently, and then wrote down the substance of his message, either he or his scribe or whatever, sometime later. And apparently after an earthquake hit, that was a sign of the truthfulness of his message. And you see that Isaiah has his books arranged in chunks, as I said before. And all the prophets are kind of that way. All the prophets bear signs of, they all spoke their message first. And a lot of the prophets didn't write down anything at all. You know, the ones that we have written, that have books in the Bible, and they were a very small number. There were a lot of prophets that never wrote anything down at all, or at least didn't write anything down that was recorded under their names in the scriptures of Elijah and Elisha, two of the most famous ones. And Elijah being the one who kind of initiated the office of the prophet as we think of it, didn't write his own book in the Bible, although it's possible he may have contributed some material that was incorporated into Kings or something like that, or Chronicles. But, so anyway, most of the prophets did not write anything down. Most of them were just speaking prophets only, and even the ones that did write their prophecies down, and those prophecies, those written accounts got added to the Hebrew canon and later incorporated into the Christian Bible. Even they spoke it first and wrote it later. So this is very common. The idea of a composite sermon that incorporates the substance of Jesus' entire message throughout his ministry is completely in line with how they had preserved their teachings from the beginning, really. Jesus is a prophet, but he's also a new lawgiver. He's also a new Moses. And so this sermon is going to be positioning him, Matthew, in this, as he does this, as he goes through this material, is going to be positioning Jesus as a new covenant bringer, a new Moses, a new lawgiver. He doesn't make the old law something I don't need to pay attention to anymore, but he fulfills it in himself and provides a new law and helps us understand the old law better. So we're going to be doing a lot of flipping back, as we did when we looked at the prophets. Remember when we went through the prophets, I said the prophets did not speak into a vacuum. They spoke to about real things, specific things that people were doing that broke specific laws that they had been given, okay, and they would call those out, okay. They weren't speaking in the abstract, and Jesus here is not speaking in the abstract. As Matthew records it here, we're not speaking in the abstract. We're calling back to the law of Moses and either further illuminating it or revealing what it really meant, or helping us understand it better, or saying this is the way you really fulfill this law. This is the first of the 5 major sections of teaching in the book of Matthew. And this is what Matthew really cares about. Matthew is less interested in the narrative of the events of Jesus' life. That is the secondary concern to Matthew. That was the main thing that Mark did. Mark told us about the things that Jesus did. Mark didn't have a lot of examples of Jesus' teachings. He had a few parables, but that was about it. He talked about Jesus as a teacher. He identified Jesus as a teacher. He said he was a teacher. But Mark didn't include a lot of examples of Jesus' teachings. He was more interested in recounting the things that Jesus did and demonstrating Jesus' authority by just his actions, the things he did. Matthew is not so concerned about that. He will include events of Jesus' life. He already has. He's given us background that Mark didn't give us in Matthew 1 through 3. But Matthew is much more interested in Jesus' teachings. So there are 5 big blocks of chunks of text in the book of Matthew, which serve as the main. It's not like Jesus only teaches in these 5 blocks, but these are the major divisions of his teaching in the book of Matthew, which of course goes back to the 5 books of Moses. Because Moses, I don't know if you can really correspond these 5 blocks of teaching to the actual 5 books of Moses. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. I don't really see how these 5 blocks of teaching kind of have a correspondence. Maybe, you know how I mentioned back when we studied the law, we looked at Leviticus, and we looked at the entire 5 books of Moses. We said that it was kind of arranged in a pyramid form. You look at Leviticus in particular, it's specifically arranged to have the Day of Atonement section in the middle, at the top of the pyramid. And then on either side, down the pyramid, you have these corresponding sections. Okay, at the beginning of the book, you have the sacrifices. That's section A. And you have a corresponding section about the rituals and the days at the end of the book, at the end of Leviticus. So that would be a corresponding section A. And then in the middle section, you have sections about the priests. So after Leviticus 7, Leviticus 1 through 7 is about the sacrifices. That's section A. Then section B is Leviticus 8, I think, through 11, which is about the priests, and that's actually narrative. It's something the priests did. And then Leviticus, from there until Leviticus 18 is where the Day of Atonement sections are. And then the next section is about the purity laws. And then you had the little Day of Atonement kind of at the top of the pyramid. And then coming down the other side of the pyramid, you have a section about the purity laws right after the Day of Atonement. You have a section about the priests right after and their duties as basically doctors for Israel. Right after the other section of purity laws. So there's sections. So you have A, B, C. Okay, you have the section A on the way up the mountain from Leviticus 1 through 7. You have the sacrifices. Then section B, the priests. Then section C, the purity laws, and the Day of Atonement. Then you have a corresponding section C, more purity laws coming down the mountain on the other side. You have another section B corresponding to the priests, and then another section A corresponding sacrifices. This is about the rituals and the feast days, and how that is, and that itself is kind of a template for the entire book, Works of Moses. Leviticus is in the midway point of the books of Moses, and it's like it's kind of like it's arranged in a way about going into the Holy of Holies. Like as you get closer and closer to God, you get closer and closer to purity, and then you come out and you do your tasks in life after you've worship of the Holy of Holies or something. And the whole Works of Moses that way. You have the beginning in Genesis, which on the one side that corresponds to the epilogue, Deuteronomy on the other side, and you have Exodus, which is about them coming out of Egypt, and of course on the other side you have Numbers, which is about them going into the land. So it could be that there's some kind of symmetry there too with these 5 blocks of teaching. I'm not really sure. It's also could correspond to the 5 books of the Psalms, which themselves, of course, are modeled after the 5 works of Moses. So anyway, this is the first of these sections. It's the longest, except by word count, I'm not sure, but it's like it's a big one, and it provides us an overall view of Jesus' teaching. And some people have called this, referred to this as like the Constitution of the Kingdom. Like this is the written way. This is the way of life, and for those who want to be citizens of God's kingdom. I'm going to start a new video before I actually begin reading it. Oh, and by the way, Jesus' ministry has begun now. I mean, I guess technically it ended at the very end of chapter 4. Matthew has divided, in addition to the 5 major blocks of teaching, Matthew has divided his book into 3 parts. You have the beginning, the middle, and the end. The beginning is basically everything from Matthew, the beginning of the book, to the end of chapter 4, when Jesus' ministry officially starts somewhere at the end of chapter 4. And now we are in the middle portion of the book, which is about his actual ministry. Another thing also, and that will go into about chapter 16 or so, is then we begin the climax about him going to Jerusalem. Another thing also is that I mentioned a moment ago about how Matthew is less concerned about narrating the events of Jesus' life and more concerned about his teaching. And he has structured his book around these 5 major blocks of teaching, and then the narrative sections that he includes between them are there to show us this teaching and practice. Matthew was an apostle. I believe he is the writer of this book. I don't see any reason to challenge or question that. So he was present for many, if not all of these events, maybe not quite all of them. We'll read about his call later on, so he may not have been present for some of the early events. And he wasn't a member of the inner circle of Peter, James, and John, so he may not have been present for the events that they saw. But he was present with Jesus during his ministry and saw and experienced this stuff. However, he seems to be relying in it, but he focuses on the teaching. Again, as I said, that's what he focuses on. He's a good Hebrew in that regard. That's what they liked, was teaching. And he seems less concerned about the events, and he seems content, to me, when I read these books, these Gospels, he seems content to let his account of Jesus' event, of the events of Jesus' life, to be modeled after Mark's. Okay, he was present for these, probably present for more than Mark was, because Mark was not an apostle. Now, Mark may have been a member of the wider circle of people who followed Jesus around occasionally. I mentioned that earlier when we covered the book of Mark, so he may have been present for some of them. He may have been familiar with some of those events, but Matthew would have been familiar personally with more of them, because he was one of the 12 apostles. But he seems content to let Mark, to follow, to base his record of the events of Jesus' life after Mark's. So we're not probably going to get to any of that, because we'll have to get into Matthew 8 before we can get back to the events of Jesus' life. And we're not going to get to that today. But Matthew's priority is Jesus' teaching. He arranges his accounts of the events of Jesus' life in service to his arrangement of Jesus' teaching, and seems to allow Mark to kind of carry most of that weight. He doesn't go into the events in as much detail as Mark did, and he seems to kind of be including much of the same information that Mark did. So he seems to allow Mark's account of Jesus' life to kind of serve as a basis for his own narrative of the events of Jesus' life, while he focuses mainly on drawing out Jesus' teaching, which Mark did not do. Mark did not focus on that. I said before, and I mentioned it again before I finish this video, since Mark was an associate of Peter, and a lot of people believe that Mark got a lot of his material from Peter. Now, Mark may have been present for some of the events himself, possibly, but his primary source of information seems to have been Peter. And Peter, as we know from the Gospels and even from Acts, was a man of action. And so Peter himself may have been drawn to Jesus because of his action and his authority. Some guys are like that. I'm not really. I'm kind of like Matthew. I would get drawn to Jesus because of the wisdom of his teaching. Like, that would speak to me. It does speak to me. I like the book of Matthew for that reason. Okay? Like, that is, that is something that appeals to me personally in a way that, decisive acting authority doesn't so much. I'm not a man of authority. Okay? I'm not a man of action. I think Peter thought of himself as a man of action. I mean, he may not have even, Peter may not have thought of himself. He was a man of action. He may not have thought of himself as a man of action, but he was. Clearly, from the account we have of him throughout the New Testament, he was clearly a guy who liked to do things, a guy who liked to take the lead, or he just naturally did. Maybe he didn't like to, maybe he just naturally did. Maybe that was just how he was. And so it could be that Jesus, he was drawn to Jesus by Jesus's assertiveness and authority, and so when he passed his message on, that's what he focused on. That was what appealed to him, so that's what came out in his own teachings of Jesus. Whereas Matthew may have been more attuned to the wisdom of Jesus' teaching, and that is what he focused on when he gave his. Like I said, I believe Matthew wrote his gospel down originally as a collection of Jesus' teachings, probably in the Hebrew language, and copies that we either don't have any longer, or they've been corrupted. And eventually, probably after Mark started circulating his gospel, or he became aware of Mark's gospel, he rewrote, and the Greeks and Gentiles became more prominent in the church, and the Jewish Christians left Jerusalem. It kind of as that process would have been going on throughout the middle of the first century. At some point, Matthew, I believe, rewrote his gospel from the ground up. Not translated it, but just rewrote it, wrote it again, in Greek, this time incorporating events and weaving them into his accounts of Jesus' teaching, which I believe initially, that's all his gospel was a collection of Jesus' teaching. Anyway, that's the setup for the Sermon on the Mount, and we're going to actually get started reading it next.